When archaeologists talk about seafaring humans, what do they date that to?
The great seafaring adventure that is accepted by archaeology is called the Polynesian expansion. And it's a remarkable story. And that occurs roughly 3,000 to 3,500 years ago.
We're told civilization began only a few thousand years ago, but ancient maps suggest otherwise. Some show Antarctica centuries before its discovery. Others reveal Ice Age coastlines that no modern tools should have measured. Graham Hancock argues these maps point to a forgotten civilization wiped out by disaster. Join us today as we explore the map they tried to hide and why it changes everything we know about the past.
You ask who the most successful navigators are and the most successful types of ships. Very few people would give you the correct answer, which is the Polynesian seagoing canoe and Polynesian navigators.
The official story of seafaring. In a world where we often think all the great mysteries of the past have already been solved, a conversation between Joe Rogan and Graham Hancock opens the door to a different story. It's a story about the sea, about who truly mastered it first, and whether history has been told in full. When archaeologists speak of the beginning of long-distance ocean travel, they almost always start with the Polynesians. Roughly 3,000 years ago, maybe a little earlier, closer to 3,500, these islanders launched their voyages into the Pacific. Their abilities were extraordinary. Without compasses, maps, or GPS, they built double-hulled canoes and crossed thousands of miles of open water. They used the stars as their guide. They studied the winds and traced the swell of the waves. Their knowledge allowed them to aim for the smallest islands and find them with astonishing accuracy. One of the clearest examples is Easter Island. This tiny volcanic rock lies about 2,000 miles from the coast of South America and nearly the same distance from Tahiti. It's one of the most remote spots on Earth. Yet the Polynesians not only discovered it, they carried enough people across that vast distance to establish a thriving community. They even managed return trips. That's not chance. That's navigation at a level that seems almost impossible without modern tools. For mainstream archaeology, this is where the story of seafaring begins. The Polynesians are celebrated as the first true masters of the oceans, and rightly so. Their achievement is undeniable. It's the version of history found in textbooks and classrooms. But Graham Hancock urges us to look deeper. If Polynesians could achieve such feats 3,000 years ago, why assume nobody else did it earlier? Boats existed long before the Polynesian expansion. In Egypt, for example, wooden ships were sailing rivers and coastlines at least 4,500 years ago. Strong enough to carry cargo, crews, and sails, why believe those vessels never pushed into the open sea? The standard answer is blunt. There's no accepted proof. Archaeologists say the record begins with Polynesia. Anything earlier is dismissed as speculation, but Hancock points to evidence that doesn't fit neatly into that story. Clues appear in unexpected places. One of the most striking comes not from ruins or artifacts, but from DNA. Genetic studies in the Amazon show connections between indigenous groups in South America and distant Pacific populations. These links shouldn't exist if ocean travel only began 3,000 years ago. Still, many scholars resist the implications. They argue that long-distance voyaging wasn't possible before Polynesia. It's a clean, simple version of history, but history itself is rarely clean or simple. Now consider another possibility. 12,000 years ago, at the end of the Ice Age, the world looked very different. Coastlines stretched further. Vast areas of land now underwater were dry and inhabited. If humans at that time were already exploring oceans, their traces may have been swallowed by rising seas, their knowledge erased, leaving only fragments behind. This is the challenge Hancock lays out. Not to deny the brilliance of the Polynesians, but to question the assumption that they were the first. Maybe they were the last great inheritors of a tradition far older, one that began in an age we no longer remember. DNA evidence that doesn't fit. When most people think of early contact between human populations, they picture migrations across land, hunters following herds, families moving step by step over generations. But what happens when the evidence suggests that thousands of years ago, people made connections across vast oceans? That's exactly the riddle hidden inside human DNA. In recent years, geneticists have studied the people of the Amazon rainforest. Deep in South America, some indigenous groups carry a genetic signature that shouldn't be there, one that links them not to their neighbors, but to populations living thousands of miles away across the Pacific. This isn't just a random marker, it's a clear thread in the genetic fabric, pointing to contact long before written history. And it doesn't fit the accepted timeline. According to mainstream archaeology, long-distance ocean travel didn't begin until about 3,000 years ago with the Polynesians. But the Amazonian DNA evidence suggests something far older. It points to a connection that may go back 10,000 years or more, during a time when sea levels were lower and coastlines stretched further out. So how did it get there? The official explanation is cautious. Some scientists suggest the genetic markers may have been carried through ancient land migrations. Perhaps people moved slowly over generations, bringing the signal with them. But that theory raises problems. The distribution isn't scattered evenly, as you'd expect if it came by land. It shows up in specific groups deep inside South America, as if a small population arrived by sea and mixed with locals. This is where Graham Hancock raises his question. Are we looking at the fingerprints of forgotten voyagers? Think about what this would mean. If contact happened thousands of years before the Polynesians, then people must have been crossing oceans at a time when archaeology says they couldn't. They didn't have the supposed technology. They didn't have the supposed ships. But the DNA suggests otherwise. For archaeologists committed to the traditional story, this is uncomfortable. It challenges a foundation of their timeline. The Polynesians become not the pioneers, but the inheritors of an older tradition. And there's another layer to this puzzle. We know for certain that human beings were clever with boats earlier than often admitted. The evidence is right in front of us. People reached Australia over 40,000 years ago, and they couldn't have walked there. They had to cross open sea. That alone proves humans were capable of seafaring tens of thousands of years ago. So why should it be impossible that people crossed the Pacific long before 3,000 years ago? The Amazonian DNA doesn't just whisper this possibility, it shouts it. Still, most of the academic world resists. Some dismiss the evidence as a fluke or an error in analysis. Others prefer explanations that keep the timeline intact, even if those explanations don't quite fit the data. To them, the idea of Ice Age seafarers mapping the globe sounds too far-fetched. But the DNA doesn't care about opinions. It's there, etched into the cells of living people. It's a biological memory of a journey no one recorded, a journey across thousands of miles of ocean, leaving behind no sails, no logs, no monuments, only a genetic footprint. And this is where the suspense lies. If a small group made it across the ocean thousands of years before the Polynesians, then who were they? Where did they come from? And why have their stories been lost while only their DNA remains? The mystery of ancient maps. Maps are supposed to tell us where we are. They're supposed to reflect what explorers knew at the time, but every so often a map shows us something it shouldn't, details that belong to an age long before the mapmaker's world. One of the most puzzling examples is the Piri Reis map, drawn in 1513 by a Turkish admiral. Only a fragment survives, but that fragment has baffled historians for generations. It shows parts of South America and Africa with surprising accuracy, but Piri Reis admitted he didn't chart them himself. In his own handwriting, he explained that he copied from older charts, some more than 1,000 years old, possibly even saved from the Library of Alexandria before it was destroyed. That claim alone is remarkable, but the deeper puzzle lies in the details. Some of the coastlines on his map don't look the way they do today. They look the way they would have during the last ice age, when glaciers locked up massive amounts of water and sea levels were hundreds of feet lower than now. This isn't an isolated case. Throughout the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, other cartographers produced maps that contain the same strange features. They were often working with information passed down from sources they didn't fully understand. When modern researchers compared these maps with reconstructions of Ice Age geography, the match was uncanny. Here's the problem. Latitude, the distance north or south, is relatively easy to measure. All you need is the angle of the sun or stars above the horizon. Ancient sailors could do that with simple tools. But longitude, the distance east or west, is a different story. To calculate it, you need precise timekeeping. A ship has to know what time it was at its home port, then compare that with the local time at sea, which is measured by the position of the sun. The difference gives longitude. Without a clock that stays accurate on a rolling, pitching ship, it's impossible to know. And such a clock didn't exist until the late 1700s, when English clockmaker John Harrison solved the problem with his marine chronometer. Before that, ships regularly missed their destinations, sailing into coastlines they thought were far away. And yet, the maps Peary Race drew from, and others like it, show coastlines positioned with a precision that suggests someone, somewhere, had already solved the longitude problem. Not in the 18th century, but in an age long forgotten. One of the strangest cases involves Greenland. Today it lies under a massive ice sheet, miles thick in places. But some old maps show it divided into sections, like islands, as if cartographers knew its hidden bedrock topography. Modern science only confirmed that shape with radar mapping in the 20th century. So how could maps made hundreds of years ago, or based on much older sources, show what lies beneath the ice? And then there is Antarctica. Officially, it wasn't discovered until 1820, yet older maps place it correctly, not only in position but in form. Some even depict it as if it were free of ice, with bays and inlets visible, features confirmed by modern surveys of the land beneath the glaciers. The last time Antarctica was free of ice in those regions was more than 6,000 years ago, and in some places more than 10,000. All of this raises the same question. Who first charted these coastlines? If medieval and Renaissance mapmakers were copying from ancient sources, those sources must have come from a civilization capable of global navigation, precise measurements, and perhaps technology lost to time. Antarctica before its discovery. In 1818, a mapmaker named John Pinkerton published one of the most respected world maps of his era. It showed the continents as explorers of the time understood them: North America, South America, Africa, Europe, Asia, Australia. But at the bottom of the world, there was nothing. A blank space, no Antarctica. The reason is simple. In 1818, Antarctica had not yet been discovered. The first official sighting of the frozen continent didn't happen until 2 years later, in 1820. Until then, Europeans could only guess at what might exist in the far south. Some thought there was land there. Others believed it was just endless ocean. That's what makes the older maps so strange. Long before Antarctica was officially seen, several maps show it, not only in the right location but with an outline remarkably similar to what modern charts reveal. And some of these maps don't just show a frozen land mass. They depict Antarctica as if it were free of ice, with bays, rivers, and coastlines that match what scientists later discovered beneath the glaciers. Modern radar and satellite scans now allow us to see the hidden land under Antarctica's ice sheet. It's a rocky, mountainous continent with valleys and ridges buried under ice more than a mile thick. Yet somehow, cartographers working centuries ago had access to source maps that seemed to know its shape. The puzzle is enormous. The ice covering Antarctica today is tens of thousands of years old. According to glaciologists, large portions of the coastline have been sealed under ice for at least 6,000 years, in some areas much longer. That means whoever first mapped it must have done so in a time when the ice hadn't yet buried the land, or they had knowledge passed down from people who lived during that era. To mainstream historians, this is almost impossible to accept. The common explanation is that old map makers simply guessed. They imagined a southern continent to balance the globe, a landmass they believed had to exist. But guesses don't explain the accuracy. These maps don't just sketch a vague southern blob. They outline coastlines in ways that match what we know today with precision. Take the Orontius Phineas map from 1531. It shows a landmass at the bottom of the world that looks startlingly like Antarctica. Its proportions, mountain ranges, and bays are in the right places, far too close to modern measurements to be written off as chance. Centuries later, when explorers finally sailed the icy seas around Antarctica, they found the land was exactly where these ancient charts had placed it. So where did the knowledge come from? Hancock argues that this is evidence of a lost seafaring culture, a people alive during the Ice Age, when sea levels were lower and parts of Antarctica's coastline may have been exposed. They may have mapped the world's oceans with technology we no longer recognize, preserving their knowledge in charts that were copied and recopied until they reached medieval and Renaissance Europe. It's a possibility that unsettles the established timeline. If true, it means human beings were not just surviving in the Ice Age. They were thriving, exploring, and charting the edges of the world. Their records may have been scattered, hidden, or nearly destroyed, but fragments survived long enough to reach the hands of mapmakers who didn't fully understand what they were copying. The Bimini Road enigma. In the shallow waters of the Bahamas, divers have found something strange. Just off the island of Bimini lies a long formation of massive stone blocks, arranged in a line that looks remarkably like a road. Locals call it the Bimini Road. To some, it's simply a natural formation, a quirk of geology. To others, it's a clue, an artifact that doesn't belong in the timeline we've been taught. The structure sits under about 20 feet of clear water, stretching nearly 1,600 feet. Its blocks are rectangular, some measuring 10 to 15 feet across. They look as though they've been cut and fitted together, forming what could be a roadway, a wall, or the foundation of something larger. Mainstream geology explains it as beach rock. In tropical regions, sand and shells can harden into limestone, which cracks into blocky shapes over time. According to this view, the Bimini Road is nothing more than natural slabs, broken and shifted by waves. But skeptics of the geological explanation point out a problem: the regularity of the stones. They are laid side by side, forming patterns that resemble deliberate construction. In some sections, smaller blocks seem to have been placed like chalks to stabilize the larger ones. To divers, it doesn't feel random. It feels planned. Yet the real mystery isn't whether humans carved the stones. It's the question of time. Today, the Bimini Road rests underwater. But thousands of years ago, during the last ice age, sea levels were much lower, over 300 feet lower than today. Large areas of the Bahamas that are now submerged were once dry land. That means if the Bimini Road is man-made, it must date back to a period when the ocean had not yet swallowed it. This takes us far outside the comfort zone of conventional archaeology. According to accepted history, the Bahamas were first settled by the Lucayan people, only a few centuries before Columbus arrived. No advanced civilization is believed to have lived there in deep prehistory. So why does a structure that looks engineered lie beneath the waves? Even stranger, the Bimini Road shows up in an old map fragment linked to the famous Peary Race collection. In that drawing, a large island appears off the coast of North America, positioned exactly where the Bimini Formation sits today. And on that island, the map shows a line of symbols running down its length. Symbols that resemble megaliths. In other words, a road of stones. If the map is based on much older charts, then whoever drew the original had seen Bimini as dry land, long before the sea reclaimed it. That suggests not only that people were there, but that they mapped it. And that pushes the timeline back thousands of years earlier than mainstream history allows. For Graham Hancock, this is the heart of the mystery. Whether the Bimini Road is natural or artificial may not be the main point. The crucial fact is that it was represented above water in maps derived from ancient sources. The last time Bimini was dry land was during the Ice Age, at least 10,000 years ago. Someone, at some time, charted it as such. Critics remain firm. They insist geology explains the blocks, and any resemblance to man-made structures is coincidental. They dismiss the maps as misinterpretations. But those who've dived at Bimini and studied its layout come away with the sense that chance alone cannot explain it. The truth may lie somewhere in between. Maybe natural processes shaped the stone, and early people adapted it for their own use. Or maybe it really was built from scratch, the remains of a lost culture that thrived before rising oceans swept it away. Was there an Ice Age civilization? At the end of the last Ice Age, about 12,800 years ago, the Earth was a very different place. Giant glaciers covered much of North America, Europe, and Asia. Sea levels were more than 300 feet lower than they are today. Vast stretches of land that are now underwater, continental shelves, coastal plains, and islands were dry ground where people could live. It was in this shifting world that something extraordinary may have happened. When you bring together the clues, genetic signals linking distant populations, maps that seem to show the world as it looked before the seas rose, and mysterious structures found below the ocean, an unsettling picture begins to form. It suggests that human civilization may not have started only a few thousand years ago with Mesopotamia or Egypt. It may have roots reaching back into the Ice Age. Graham Hancock argues that the evidence points toward a seafaring culture capable of global navigation, operating at a time long before mainstream archaeology allows. According to him, this civilization may have had the skills to chart coastlines, measure positions with remarkable accuracy, and even preserve their knowledge in maps that filtered down through history. The implications are enormous. If true, it means humanity had already achieved a level of organization, knowledge, and technology usually reserved for the modern era. It would mean that long before the rise of the first known cities, there were people traveling the oceans, exchanging ideas, and perhaps planting the seeds of later civilizations. What happened to them? The timing lines up with a catastrophic event known as the Younger Dryas, a sudden return to near-glacial conditions around 12,800 years ago. Temperatures plunged, ecosystems collapsed, and many large animals, from mammoths to giant sloths, disappeared. Some researchers propose that a comet impact or a series of massive floods triggered this sudden change. Whatever the cause, the Earth's climate was thrown into chaos. For a civilization living along Ice Age coastlines, this would have been devastating. Rising seas would have swallowed their settlements. Floods and shifting climates would have erased much of their world. In a matter of generations, almost everything they built could have been lost beneath the waves. If such a culture existed, only fragments could survive. A few oral traditions passed down as myths, a handful of structures now lying underwater, a trail of information preserved in maps, recopied through the centuries, and genetic markers quietly carried in the DNA of people living today. Critics say this theory stretches the evidence too far. They argue that the maps are misread, the underwater ruins natural formations, and the genetic signals the result of ancient land migrations. To them, the idea of an Ice Age civilization smacks of wishful thinking. But Hancock's point is not that the case is closed. His point is that the evidence deserves attention. When so many separate clues, spread across genetics, geology, and cartography, point in the same direction, perhaps it is worth asking whether our view of history is too narrow. After all, humans have been fully modern, biologically speaking, for at least 200,000 years. That's a vast span of time. Is it really so hard to imagine that people during the Ice Age might have been more advanced than we assume? That they may have achieved something remarkable, only to lose it when the world changed overnight? Controversy and pushback. When Graham Hancock's series Ancient Apocalypse debuted on Netflix, it drew millions of viewers. The show climbed into the platform's top 10 lists in dozens of countries. For many, it was thrilling, an invitation to question the story of human origins. But for others, it was a step too far. The backlash was immediate. Archaeologists and historians denounced the show, calling it misleading and dangerous. Indigenous groups went further, accusing Hancock of erasing their histories. To them, Ancient Apocalypse wasn't just another TV program. It was an assault on their cultural memory. Much of the controversy centers on Hancock's core claim that an advanced civilization may have existed during the Ice Age and that fragments of its influence shaped later cultures. To mainstream archaeology, this idea undermines centuries of careful research. Professionals argue that after more than 100 years of fieldwork, no solid material evidence supports the existence of such a civilization. They see Hancock's theories as speculation dressed up as fact. Indigenous leaders raise an even sharper concern. They say Hancock's narrative suggests that the monumental sites of the Americas and the Pacific, temples, cities, and sacred landscapes, were not the work of their ancestors, but the hand-me-downs of a forgotten people. For them, this is more than an academic debate. It feels like a continuation of colonial thinking, outsiders claiming credit for achievements that belong to native communities. The pushback became especially intense when producers of Ancient Apocalypse applied for permits to film in sacred places like the Grand Canyon and Chaco Canyon. Local tribes objected, arguing that their voices were ignored in the process. Emails later revealed that even some park officials were uneasy, describing the decision to allow filming as embarrassing and a discredit to efforts to honor indigenous traditions. Criticism also came from professional organizations. The Society for American Archaeology issued a public letter urging Netflix to label the series as fiction. They argued that Hancock's work emboldens conspiracy theories and fuels mistrust in science. Some scholars even linked it to racist ideas from the 19th century, claims that advanced knowledge must have come from outsiders rather than from indigenous builders themselves. Hancock rejects these accusations. He insists he has never tried to erase native histories. Instead, he says archaeology itself is guilty of ignoring inconvenient evidence, refusing to consider anything that doesn't fit the accepted timeline. To him, the hostility he faces is less about protecting truth and more about protecting careers. He also points out that myths and oral traditions around the world often speak of floods, lost lands, and ancient knowledge bearers. Why dismiss these stories as pure fantasy, he asks, when they may be memories of real events? To Hancock, archaeology's unwillingness to explore these possibilities is a form of blindness. Yet the tension remains. On one side are scholars who see Hancock's theories as pseudoscience, entertaining perhaps, but harmful when presented as fact. On the other side are viewers who feel inspired, even liberated, by the idea that history is far older and stranger than we've been taught. And caught in the middle are indigenous communities, who bear the weight of having their own histories questioned or overshadowed. The debate over Ancient Apocalypse is not just about ruins, maps, or DNA. It's about authority, who gets to decide the story of our past. Archaeologists argue that evidence must be physical and measurable. Hancock argues that patterns across myths, maps, and anomalies deserve serious consideration. Indigenous groups argue that their voices and traditions should be respected as living history. What's clear is that Hancock has touched a nerve. His theories challenge academic authority, attract huge audiences, and provoke strong emotions. Whether viewed as a bold truth seeker or a dangerous storyteller, he has forced a global conversation about the deep past. Rethinking human history. We are taught that human history is a steady climb, from caves to villages, from villages to cities, and from cities to empires. The story is presented as a straight line, simple and neat. But what if that line isn't straight at all? What if the path of human civilization is broken, with entire chapters erased, leaving us only fragments of a much deeper story? This is the challenge Graham Hancock leaves us with. He asks us to imagine that our distant ancestors were not just hunters struggling to survive, but people who may have held knowledge far greater than we allow. People who might have mapped the world, traveled oceans, and passed on wisdom before disaster struck. Consider this: modern humans, physically and mentally like us, have been around for at least 200,000 years. Yet the history we study in schools covers only a fraction of that time, mostly the last 5,000 years. That leaves nearly 195,000 years of human experience unaccounted for. Is it really so hard to believe that something advanced could have risen and then vanished during that enormous span of time? Hancock argues that this missing chapter may lie in the Ice Age. Imagine coastlines stretching miles farther than they do today, great plains now drowned beneath the sea, and cities built on land that no longer exists. If people once thrived there, their homes and harbors would now rest hundreds of feet underwater. Archaeology rarely explores those submerged regions, which means the evidence could be hidden in plain sight, just out of reach beneath the waves. If our ancestors did map the world, it changes everything we know about the origins of navigation. It would mean that accurate cartography didn't begin with explorers like Columbus or Magellan. It began thousands of years earlier, when unknown mariners charted coastlines during the last ice age. Thank you for watching. Like, comment, subscribe. More content coming your way. See you next time.